Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I would like to welcome you to all of the people who's here in this 155th event. This cycle started in May 2020. This year, we are celebrating 50 years of Horas Konu, a very sensitive and significant anniversary due to the difficult times we are going through. However, as a reference in health in the region, we continue uninterruptedly with the joint and articulated actions with the six-member countries, Bolivia, Colombia, Chile, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela, fulfilling thus the goals and objectives to strengthen the health of our people. As a health reference, we highlight a message for the critical epidemiological situation in the region. Important dates are approaching to celebrate and give thanks for the company and shared love of our loved ones. We are intensifying our vaccination campaigns, and remember that vaccines against COVID-19 need to be boosted, and that the priority age group, because of their vulnerability, are the elderly. This is why it is necessary to complete our vaccination schemes. Apart from this, it is important to keep the care measures like using masks, hand washing, and isolation of people with respiratory diseases. Remember that in those places where there's more concentration of people, there is an increased risk of having COVID-19, and this is why we have to ventilate our rooms all the time and keep our masks. Now, regarding the current situation of avian influenza, you need to hinder contact with poultry and need to report all of the authorities if you happen to get in touch with one. The solidarity and respect for others is to be highlighted. We have important dates to celebrate. Let's not show honor and respect by looking after ourselves and others with the preventative measures of COVID-19. Today, December 15th, we open our virtual doors to deal with a very important topic, with sexual and gender diversity, update on definitions and situation of access to rights under the framework of Human Rights Day. We invite you to leave us your name, organization, and country from which you are joining us through the comment box of the Facebook Live chat or YouTube Live. In that same space, you can leave your questions or send them via email to webinarhorasconu@gmail.com. To access the certificate of attendance to this webinar, as usual, you must fill out a short survey and leave your data in the fixed link found in the Facebook Live or YouTube Live chats. This certificate will be sent to your email in the next few days. This webinar will be developed with the usual dynamics. We will start with the institutional greeting, then we have the presentations of our speakers, the active pause, and the space for questions and answers. To begin this important day, I will give the floor to Dr. Maria del Carmen Calle, Executive Secretary of Horas Konu, who will give the welcome and institutional greeting. Go ahead, Dr. Calle. Thank you very much, or Forley. The members of the Horas Konu, by way of different activities that they carry out in their committees and international spaces, they have been showing their great capacity as agents of change in favor of rights. As it is expressed in our institutional mission, we are devoted to harmonizing, articulating, and implementing decisions in health and to reduce inequalities and inequities associated with it. With this active commitment, today, December 15, we continue to commemorate Human Rights Day, celebrated every December the 10th. In this context, it is therefore essential to raise awareness about the situation of guaranteeing the rights of historically marginalized and invisibilized populations, among which we find the LGBTIQ plus collective. In Peru, as in many Andean countries, members of this collective face multiple barriers to access: health, education, work, and justice. Just to give a few brief examples, from 2014 to 2020, 1,292 people of dissenting sexual orientation or gender identity were murdered in Latin America, despite the fact that Peru, as well as Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, and Ecuador, has indeed implemented regulations for the protection of the LGBTIQ plus collective and the categorization of hate crimes. According to a study by the Public Ministry in collaboration with the Observatory of LGBT Law of the UPCH, there is an estimated underreporting of 68 percentage points in homicide cases out of a total of 70% homicides with signs of violence due to prejudice against the LGBTIQ plus collective. Only 2.2% of them are officially registered. This is actually a very serious situation, as it does not allow the magnitude of the problem to become evident, a situation that used to occur in cases of violence against women. According to a study by Red Trans, in the first semester of the COVID-19 pandemic, 85% of Peruvian trans women lost their jobs. This percentage, as shown in the PromSex report, which central results and conclusions will be also addressed in this webinar, is 16 times higher than the percentage of unemployment of the EAP in 2021. Likewise, labor opportunities are limited, and sex work still predominates, accounting for 28.5% as one of the majority occupations where the rights to life and health are also violated. So what are the main factors of all of this? Stigma and educational and employment discrimination for transgender people in general. These are actually specific examples of these injustices that affect the health and well-being of the collective in the Andean countries. Undoubtedly, as agents of change, we must join in the defense of their rights. Hence, this month, we started with the awareness raising of the Executive Secretariat team through a technical meeting facilitated by Romina Uribe, a PromSex professional, where we were actually able to clarify basic concepts. After that enriching experience, today we will take the next step forward in learning with you in a webinar in which we will address the ABC of sexual and gender diversity, the main advances, challenges, and recommendations for guaranteeing the exercise of the rights of the LGBTI population in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the situation of the LGBTI plus community in Latin America and the Caribbean. Therefore, we have very experienced speakers, Dr. Elida Guerra, the Commissioner Roberta Clark, and Ari Vera. They will guide us to extend our knowledge on these sensitive and important issues for the course towards the effective guarantee of rights that includes all people. So welcome, and thank you very much for giving us your valuable time, knowledge, dear speakers. I will also like to take this opportunity to share with you that this is the number 155th webinar. We have started with all of our work in May 2020. And the truth is that we actually feel very, very happy because we have never stopped. And this is the last webinar of this year. We are going on vacation. And you know that we have vacations as well, and we will be back on January 11th. So don't ask, because we won't have any webinars then, and we will start with the first webinar on January 19th. We are certain that we will have all of you there in 2023. So thank you very much. And I would like to welcome all of the participants who are already online. Well, thank you very much, Elida, Roberta, and Ari, for being here with us. Thank you very much, Dr. Calle, for these words. Now, after the greetings, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Forli Chavez Romero. I'm a public health and global health professional, a member of the technical team of Orasconu, where I participate in the Andean Intersectoral Roundtable for coordination against health inequalities. So after this introduction, we will begin this event with a warm welcome to Dr. Elida Guerra. Dr. Guerra is a lawyer with a PhD in law from the University of Mar del Plata in Argentina, Master in Human Rights and Human Security from the University of Milan, Italy, and has a Master in International Cooperation and Humanitarian Aid from the Humanitarian Aid Studies Center of Spain. She has an extensive experience as a consultant and researcher in international human rights issues. Currently, she is the coordinator of strategic litigation at the Center for the Promotion and Defense of Sexual and Reproductive Rights, better known as PROMSEX. Welcome, Dr. Elida Guerra. So the space is yours now. Thank you very much, Orly, for the presentation. I'm allowed to share my PPT? Sure. I don't know if you can see it. Not yet. Well, now we can. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much for the presentation and the introduction. I would like to extend my greetings and gratitude for the invitation and say hi to the experts who are joining us today, Ari and Roberta, and all of the people who are joining us today live at this webinar. I was given 3 topics, which is the ABC of sexual diversity, the inclusive language, and some findings from the annual report on the situation and rights of LGBTI people. And I will try to be concise. I don't have much time, but if you had questions, please do not hesitate in asking these questions at the end. Well, first, I would like to use just give me 1 second. I have tried so as to explain about sexual diversity and the ABC. I wanted to use this ginger cookie, which is actually very illustrative, and it helps to conceptualize each of these categories, which are related to the rights of LGBTI people. I will mention some of this. Among them, I would like to highlight gender identity, which is here in the cookie. The gender identity is this internal experience of gender. This is how one feels the assigned sex, could be assigned sex at birth. And we can see, well, we have the cisgender It could be man, women, or trans, binary, men, women, non-binary. Regarding the gender expression is an external manifestation of a person's gender. And this manifestation can include the way they dress, their social behavior, body modifications, among others. Apart from this, we have sexual characteristics or biological differences between men and women, which are those physical features regarding their genitalia, hormones, or chromosomes, which are also depicted in the cookie, and we have sexual orientation, which might be representing more than one gender. We can have asexuality, bisexuality, pansexuality, homosexuality, heterosexuality. And apart from this, we have considered to include the cultural identity. I've added muxe here. This is a Zapoteca term, which is a man assuming feminine roles. And there are different identities apart from this. What do I want to highlight with this first slide? There are different categories which have been defined, but this does not mean that there are no that there are not further categories which might be added. When we speak about the rights of LGBTI people, plus, this plus means that there are other categories. This is open to other categories, and this is also something that we have to mention. I echo the report on the rights of LGBTI people, where there's a whole list of these rights, but we can find this also in the glossary of terms. We can find reference in the glossary. Additional to this, we wanted to highlight why it is important to use inclusive language. And I want to highlight here that at this report, there is a report called "If You Don't Name Me, I Don't Exist," promoting inclusive language in public agencies. This is the group of proposals of words in the Spanish language that are seeking to personalize the presence of women, men, and non-binary people. When you write, when you speak, when you represent these groups. And we see this with some strategies that the Ministry of Women has explained. There are three strategies in terms of the inclusive language use. The first one is neutralizing gender, visibilizing both genders and identifying each person. Of course, when I refer to men and women, I am including diversity. This is a table that illustrates how we can put this into practice. If we are if we use each one of the strategies, we can divide the first strategy as we are neutralizing gender here. And this works in Spanish, but not in English. Or we can indicate that whoever has won needs to come close to the office. In terms of making both genders visible, we can mention that the winner, either he or she, will have to approach the human resource office. This is just an example, because in Spanish we have él or la, which is different. It's like he or she. And this is what we are used to using in our written documents. We say he or she, he/she. And instead of trying to, or we can use the name of the person if we are like mentioning someone who's specific. So what this inclusive language will give us is that we can use a neutral language to make sure that we are including all of those people have uh, who are represented, and we want to make them all visible. And this is a token of respect and a way of guaranteeing the rights. On the other hand, I wanted to mention some of the findings that we gained from an annual report on the situation of human rights of LGBTI people in Peru of 2021. And I would like to extend this to Commissioner Roberta Clark. She was there when this report was presented, I remember. And I want to mention first what's the structure of this report and why we are suggesting a revision. In the first chapter, we have detailed the general situation of violence and discrimination against the LGBTI people, bearing in mind that throughout the pandemic, due to COVID-19, this situation of discrimination and violence was exacerbating exponentially. And we are also realizing how these situations have affected LGBTI people. And in the second chapter, which is the international legal framework, we have made reference to all of the pronouncements of the treaties, which have specifically mentioned something related to the protection of LGBTI people. Uh, I think that this is important because there are lots of recommendations in the Peruvian state which are still a challenge because they have not been materialized. And we are discussing the importance of all of these pronouncements by international agents and how these principles should be applied so that this whole international framework will be accepted in practice. The I'm sorry, Elida, but you need to slow down because you are speaking way too fast and we are having simultaneous interpretation. Okay, so I will try to slow down. Now, regarding chapter 3, we have mentioned some flagship cases of LGBTI people. Among them, we have mentioned this case of these two moms and the Ugarteche case. This was important, even more so, to set the context of the situation that we were having in terms of access to justice and how many of these cases were not actually being responded to from the courts. Apart from this, in this report, something that we have carried out is a survey, a preliminary survey that we did it through Google Docs. This survey was completed by a reduced group of 90 people approximately, and we have to highlight that one of the difficulties is that this was carried out through the internet, and we know that those people who could not have access to this could not complete the survey, and this is just a clarification I wanted to make. However, in the understanding that there's no breakdown in Peru which might represent violence against LGBTI, at least we know what's the situation about the rights of these people and the social, cultural, economic rights they have. And I would like to refer to the right to have a job, basically. When we refer to the right to have a job in this survey, we can determine that 62.2% of the respondents that 62.2% of respondents could not have access to a job. However, we have highlighted that many of the people who could have access were receiving the minimum wage or even less, and they have access to a job, but an informal job. Regarding the right to education, 69.3% could not have access or couldn't continue with their education, formal education, because of the lack of money. But the important thing here is that approximately more than 22% couldn't have access or continue because they felt or have been victims of discrimination. So I think this is important. We have to mention this because if we already have a lack of protection of LGBTI because there's no regulatory framework, indeed, this lack of regulatory framework might generate certain vulnerabilities to these people. Now, regarding the right to health, we now know that there's more than 34.4% of people who have a private insurance because many of them cannot have access to public insurance. They have not been registered in the CIS. This is a comprehensive insurance, allegedly, with deficiencies, but it is actually universal and it needs to guarantee the rights to health. Most of them have a private insurance because this is one way they can have access to a health center. Now, regarding access to justice, we have reported that 17.5% of this community was discriminated against because of their gender identity at the state services which look after cases of violence, and 21.7% responded haven't been discriminated against when they wanted to file a claim. Even more so, in the understanding that when we speak about access to justice, this is a conducing thread from the very moment a person can go to a police station and file a claim, from the very moment there's a response from the justice administration. And there are different stages in the access to justice, and there's 21.7% of these people have been discriminated against in this first stage. There's not very likely that we will have repair in these cases. So this report, apart from these findings regarding the rights, the first thing that we detect is that we need to have a consistent legal framework. We didn't have a law that will protect gender identity or same-sex marriages and so on and so forth. We don't have policies or plans of specialized protocols in terms of justice administration. So this actually opens the room for discrimination against LGBTI people. In March 2020, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has declared the Peruvian state as responsible for violating the rights of Azul, a trans woman who was tortured, and established measures to correct this. And in Peru, there was structural discrimination and institutionalized violence against LGBTI people. When the report was prepared, this is still outstanding. There is still this situation, which is actually a challenge for the Peruvian state, which needs to be dealt with. We have now some recommendations included in this report. To the executive branch, We have indicated that there's a need to have a single broken down report against these people, and we need to guarantee the implementation of differentiated protocols in terms of health, education, and labor. Now, the recommendations issued to the Congress, we need to approve a bill on gender identity, among many other measures that we are recommending. There's also recommendations issued to the system of justice. These are some of the recommendations, not all. And we, with this report, we have highlighted something here. We hope that this is something that will be dealt with soon, and the impact of the pandemic actually exacerbated the violation of the rights. Víctor Madrigal visited Peru, and he was able to take note at the different meetings that he had with the civil society organizations of this situation, which is increasingly worse in terms of the vulnerabilities. And we also see that there's no way out so far. So it is also important. And I would like to echo the other opinions from the people who are listening to this webinar. We urge you to read the report. You are more than welcome to read it. And well, this is everything on my end. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. We would like to thank Dr. Guerra for her presentation. She started her presentation with a very important dynamic with the ginger cookie. This is very important in terms of these topics that we are discussing today. Gender identity is one of them. This is how you identify yourself, how you live your gender, which might or not be related to the sex assigned at birth. Then we have different modifications, sexual orientation, which refers to the capacity to feel. She mentioned some of the strategies for the use of inclusive language, how to neutralize gender, how to make gender visible, and how to identify the person per se. She has also shared some of the conclusions on the situation of human rights of LGBTI people in Peru, 2021. And then we will share this link in the chat box. And she finishes with a very powerful message where she says that the Peruvian state, and I would add many other states as well, have an outstanding debt with LGBTI people in terms of health, of education, of access to justice, access to identity, and access to rights as well. So as a representative of PromSex, she gave important recommendations to the different powers of the state. We would like to thank you for the presentation, and please remain in the room because in the end we will have a Q&A session. Now, we would like to extend a warm welcome to Commissioner Roberta Clark. Commissioner Roberta Clark was elected at the 51st regular session of the OAS General Assembly as rapporteur on the rights of LGBTI people on November 12, 2021 for a 4-year term from January 1st, 2022 to December 31st, 2025. She has led UN Women regional offices in East and Southern Africa, Asia Pacific, the Caribbean, and Libya. Prior to her career at the United Nations, she was a lawyer in Trinidad and Tobago. She has been involved in civil society at the national and international levels, including her role as chair of the Executive Committee of the International Commission of Jurists, chair of the Coalition Against Domestic Violence in Trinidad and Tobago, and chair of the Harassment Committee of the Caribbean Court of Justice. She is a citizen of Barbados and a strong activist for social justice and gender equality. Welcome, dear Commissioner Roberta Clark. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Forley. I want to thank Dr. Kai for her invitation to the Commission to be part of this 155th session. I have to say, rather an impressive record of work since May 2020. And I want to also recognize the other panelists, Elida, as well as Elida Morales, and everyone who is with us here on this Zoom, as well as listening in on YouTube or Facebook or wherever we are in the virtual universe. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening or good morning, depending on where you are. I want to share my screen, so let me try and do that and hope that I don't have any thing go wrong with it. You know, something always goes wrong when you don't want it to go wrong. Okay. I think, are you seeing it well, Forley?
Yes? Yes,
okay.
yes. Muchas gracias.
Okay. So, just to say that of course, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights considers that the recognition of the rights of LGBTI persons is a fundamental factor in achieving non-discrimination, equality, and dignity, as well as in combating violence in order to achieve a more just society for everyone founded on rule of law. So this is why we say getting to non-discrimination and non-violence is the business of everyone and the responsibility of everyone. Under international human rights customary law and under the jurisprudence of the Inter-American human rights system, discrimination in all its forms against LGBTI persons is a violation of human rights. And so I refer to that seminal case of Atala Rifo and daughters against the state of Chile, where the Inter-American Court on Human Rights made clear that sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expressions are protected grounds against discrimination in the context of the American Convention on Human Rights. However, as the previous speakers, both Dr. Kaye and Elida have already mentioned, the Commission notes, and more than notes, is highly concerned about the persistence of widespread forms of discrimination, prejudice, violence, and social exclusion in the Americas and the Caribbean based on sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expressions, and sex characteristics. And I really want to thank Elida for her very neat slide where she actually explained that in the very clearest ways. I think, Elida, you all should popularize that particular slide because it so graphically and simply gives the definitions and also allows us to understand the distinctions that many people are quite confused about. They say, oh, what's the difference between sex and gender? And then what's the difference between gender identity and gender expression? And then what's the difference between sexual orientation and sex characteristics? All of which I think you explained very nicely. So thank you for that. So whilst we note all of that widespread prevalence, we are also seeing some signs of change. And because I'm an optimist, and I think it's important to be both driven and to be an optimist, I think I also want to speak to some of that work, which is the result of the insistence and the strategic activism of the LGBTI human rights defenders. So there are three parts to my presentation that I've been asked to make this afternoon. The first part will talk about I think the challenges. It says progress there, but I think I'm going to start with the challenges on accessing rights by LGBTI persons in our region. The second part will be looking at some progress, some signs of good change, which we need to strengthen and deepen and expand. and then I will, like Elida, make some recommendations. Okay, so let's start off with the challenges. On repeated occasions, the Commission has noted, because we're monitoring it quite closely, so we have noted that LGBTI persons are exposed to discrimination and suffer really high rates of exclusion and social and economic exclusion, much in the way that the leader has already spoken to. They also, of course, suffer from stigmatization and social prejudice. And this has been highlighted in a series of reports prepared by the Commission, the latest being the report on social, economic, and cultural rights of trans and gender diverse persons in the Americas, and I hope you have a chance to have a look at it. It is like Dr. Kai started off by saying, that there is the level of violence against LGBTI persons is very high. And in fact, I understand from the Commission Secretariat who are monitoring this that 2021 is considered one of the most deadly years on record for trans and non-binary persons, with so many persons being killed globally. Over the last year, and I've been a commissioner since January this year, so over the last 11 months, I've had the opportunity of meeting with civil society organizations and human rights defenders from the LGBTI movement from several countries. And yes, we were in Peru, where I did meet with quite a number of organizations, and in Peru, but whether also online and in other countries. In those meetings, it was reiterated that the level of harm through violence experienced by LGBTI persons is really quite high. And the situation of violence is faced by LGBTI persons intersects with other factors such as ethnicity and race, sex, gender, migration, situation, or even status as a human rights defender. Those intersectional characteristics, identities, and locations can also exacerbate the harm experienced by LGBTI persons, and certainly increase the threats and the experience of violence. And these crimes, we understand, are not just they're violent, but they're also brutal and characterized by a high level of brutality and cruelty. Within the LGBTI nomenclature, the level of trans femicides and murders of LGBTI persons are also quite high. So we are concerned about homicides and femicides, but also we are also getting a lot of reports about children who face bullying, harassment, and are unprotected from discrimination, whether in the home, in the community, in schools, wherever they are located. So this prejudice and discrimination affects LGBTI persons across the life cycle. That's really important for us to remember when we think about recommendations. The vast majority of the crimes committed against LGBTI persons, and in particular personal crimes, that's violence, goes unpunished, and Dr. Kai has already spoken about that. And there are any number of obstacles standing in the way of access to justice. And these include fear of filing complaints because of perhaps of reprisals or the expectation of indifference on the part of police and prosecutors. There's insufficient training about due diligence investigations on the part of state actors, and just a reluctance to interface with the state, I think, has been a lot of the explanation. And then also families that don't support LGBTI persons as they seek justice. There are many factors that can explain the underreporting, to which Dr. Kai has already referenced. But certainly, this underreporting and then the underinvestigation and the prosecution leads to impunity. And impunity, of course, sends a very strong and awful message to everyone in society that violence against LGBTI persons is condoned and tolerated. And that in itself generates even more violence and leaves victims, again, further to distrust the justice system. Okay. And I also want to speak a little bit about the right to gender identity as a bit of a, not a bit, quite a bit of a challenge in our Americas and the Caribbean. So we do have now very clear jurisprudence, including the Vicky Hernandez case, which I will speak a little bit more about, and the advisory opinion of the Inter-American Court, Advisory Opinion 24 of 2017, about the right to gender identity by all persons. That's quite clear in the jurisprudence of the Inter-American human rights system now. But one of the main barriers for trans and gender non-conforming persons continues to be exactly this lack of legal recognition of gender identity. And the limitations or the lack of recognition of gender identity has many multiplier and negative consequences for LGBTI persons. It certainly limits their access sometimes to education, educational facilities, to healthcare, to the quality of the healthcare that is available to them. It may also, of course, impede employment where your gender identity does not match your identification papers. Also can affect employment prospects. Just to name a few areas in which the right to gender identity matters. And of course, where you don't have a document that matches your gender identity, it also affects your right to participate in political processes, to vote, and even to be voted for. So the lack of recognition of gender identity has really far-reaching consequences. And we within the Commission, we're very clear that legal recognition of gender identity is an important step towards effective social inclusion and an effective guarantee of the rights of trans and gender diverse persons to all types of human rights, social, economic, cultural, and political rights. So the majority of states still do not have appropriate procedures for legal gender identity recognition. And when we say appropriate, also we mean a legal framework that recognizes the right to gender identity, and then simple, accessible, inexpensive procedures to change one's identification papers, also something that has been discussed quite a lot within the region. I also want to speak a little bit about inequality in the rights to family life, which we know remains quite a problem in many countries in our region. So even though marriage equality is becoming a reality in some countries, the rights of same-sex couples and their families continue to be undermined and under-recognized. In Mexico, for example, despite marriage equality being legal across the country, and that's progress, it's a big progress, only a limited number of states have regulations on matters related to joint adoption. So yes, they do recognize same-sex marriage, but the other components of family life are not fully recognized. So, for example, the regulations on matters of joint adoption or recognition of filial bonds, not fully recognized. In Peru, the Commission is aware of the case of two mothers, and I think, Elida, you've referred to that case already, married outside of Peru and raising a child together, but the National Registry refuses, even after a court decision, to register both mothers as parents on the child's birth certificate. In Honduras, a constitutional reform was passed that makes the legalization of same-sex marriage almost impossible. So that's regression now. Not only don't you have, in this case, some countries don't have any procedure for recognizing same-sex unions, but in some countries, in fact, there are laws prohibiting that. So that's further regression that we note with a great alarm. And laws exist that bans adoption by same-sex couples also in Honduras. So similar, yeah. So again, discrimination affecting LGBTI families. I want to say that we cannot deny that historically marginalized populations, such as LGBTI persons, feel the negative impacts of crises disproportionately, whether these are natural disasters or public health pandemics, such as in COVID. Such populations tend to experience higher levels of precarious employment and unemployment, and are not fully covered by social protection, and often are ignored by policy measures that fail to take the differentiated approach that they should. So I just want to say a little bit about criminalization of consensual relations between same-sex adults. And this is, unfortunately, still a problem in a few countries in the Caribbean, where consensual activity between same-sex adults has been and remains criminalized. So that's a rather big violation of rights to freedom of expression, right to non-discrimination, right to equality of treatment that continues in some countries. The Inter-American Commission in 2020 decided in 2 cases from Jamaica on that, and they found that these laws definitely violated the prohibition on non-discrimination. So that remains an issue. But let's talk a little bit.
Can you hear me now? Could you please slow down, because you're going way too fast. Okay. And we have 20% more words in Spanish, so I'm trying to follow you.
Thank you. I'm going too fast. Okay. So I have to slow down. So I want to slow down talking about the progress that has been made. And so as I just talked about criminalization of consensual same-sex between adults in the Caribbean, we're also seeing in the very Caribbean a growing movement of countries where the judiciary, not the parliaments, but the judiciary, judges are striking down these provisions as being unconstitutional. And so we have successful litigation, and strategic litigation has been a pathway employed by LGBTI human rights defenders very successfully in the Caribbean. So we now have, I think, 5 or 6 countries where the courts have struck down criminalization as being unconstitutional and a violation of human rights. And these include Antigua and Barbados, which happened just this week, Belize, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Trinidad and Tobago. Well, Trinidad and Tobago, the government has appealed that, but certainly that's a very important judicial trend in the recognition of rights of LGBTI persons, and very encouraging. So that's some progress there. I think you all will agree with that. In relation to conversion therapy, we see countries such as Canada and Mexico banning conversion therapy. In fact, I just wanted to say that conversion therapy, I also really want to define that, because sometimes we don't know what we're talking about when we say conversion therapy, but it is any practice, treatment, or service designed to change or repress a person's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. And in Canada, when they banned conversion therapy, which they did at the end of 2021, and the act came into effect in January 2022, just this year, the act said very clearly that conversion therapy harms not just LGBTI persons, but harms society as a whole, because it is based on and propagates myths and stereotypes about sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, including the myth that heterosexuality, cisgender, gender identity, and gender expressions that conform to the sex assigned to a person at birth are to be preferred over other sexual orientations, gender identities, and gender expressions. So I really encourage you all to go and have a look at that, because it really explains how conversion therapy feeds into myths and stereotypes, and those myths and stereotypes are grounded in discrimination and prejudice. So that's sort of some progress there. We also see a trend towards the adoption of measures oriented towards the legal gender identity recognition of trans people. So I talked about the challenges, but we also see some countries that are making real progress on that. And in accordance with the Inter-American Court on Human Rights Advisory Opinion 24 of 2017. So that's really important development. So for example, in Argentina, in 2021, the right to non-binary identity in legal documents, both passports and national IDs, was advanced. So not only can you change your gender identity, you can also decide to be gender non-conforming and have the gender marker X. So that possibility has also been created in countries such as Argentina. Recently, in a Colombian Constitutional Court decision, the court demanded that non-binary option also be available in ID documents. And similarly, this year, the United States has implemented steps towards recognizing non-binary passports for American citizens. So that's really, really good progress. All 32 states of Mexico recognize same-sex unions. That's really important. And not only do these laws and policies have a positive cultural effect towards the acceptance of diverse families, but they also better support a host of other rights, such as the right to freedom of movement and equal opportunity in employment and access to services. So another positive trend. I just want to say a little bit about the Vicky Hernandez case from Honduras, where that case, which, as you all recall, had to do with the murder of Vicky Hernandez, and well, she had been harassed for quite a long time, and eventually, tragically, murdered. But the case was not properly investigated with any due diligence, and in any event, the court found that absence of due diligence investigation was also predicated on discrimination. But really importantly, that case also found that it expanded the normative universe, or the universe of human rights treaties that apply to LGBTI persons, by finding that trans women are also protected by the Belém do Pará Convention. So really very important for that. Okay, so I don't think I have much time left, but I just have maybe 6 recommendations. We are at the Commission, we're really encouraging all member states to sign and ratify the Inter-American Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination and Intolerance. That is a convention that very clearly speaks to the prohibition of discrimination against persons on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. We read that into the American Convention, but in this convention, it is actually stated very clearly. We also call upon member states to adopt measures to guarantee due diligence in preventing, investigating, punishing, and providing reparations for violence against LGBTI persons, much as, you know, what was said in the Vicky Hernandez case by the Inter-American Court. And we ask member states to take all measures to eradicate discrimination. And that means where in any sphere, in employment, in access to health, in social protection, wherever we see discrimination, that it has to be rooted out in law and in policies, but also importantly in culture, because you can change the law, but the discrimination and prejudice continues to be manifested in the actions of state actors, as we see everywhere. So you have to change laws and policies, but you also have to change culture. And finally, my last 4 recommendations here. Most of our recommendations are really directed at states. We ask states the ones that are remaining, to end criminalization of same-sex intimacy between consenting adults. We ask for all countries to recognize the right to gender identity, and to, you know, really wonderfully, what Elida's organization PromSex has done, so important, collecting data. But that data should be collected by state agents, not just by NGOs trying to fill the gap. Their responsibility to collect data so that you have policy that responds to the data is a responsibility of the state. And of course, finally, the state has a very specific responsibility to engage through the education system and its outreach to end or to root out discrimination, bias, and prejudice that is rooted in harmful norms and stereotypes and culture. So I just want to end by saying doing this work is our collective responsibility, and I really want to recognize, as we have just finished the 16 days of activism and Human Rights Day, I want to recognize the work of LGBTI human rights defenders. What you do is needed, and you are guaranteed the support of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Roberta Clark. Roberta Clark has presented on the challenges that the region of the Americas has faced, and the Caribbean as well, in terms of the LGBTI rights. The Commissioner has highlighted the unfortunate situation of violence and injustice faced by people because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, corporal diversity, or other sexual characteristics, especially during the pandemic. Despite these situations, she also mentioned that there has been significant progress in the region. There's different progress made in different countries, the adoption of measures for the recognition, legal recognition of gender identity in trans people, and the recognition of non-binary people in legal documents. Among the recommendations that she has shared, we can highlight the importance that the international agreements have against all forms of discrimination and intolerance, the recognition of the right to identity and all the rights of the LGBTI community, and the importance of fostering awareness campaigns, education on sexual diversity and gender diversity, and establishing prevention measures, research, and penalizing violence against LGBTI people. Dear Commissioner Roberta Clark, we want to thank you for your presentation, and please stay in the room. Before the next presentation, we would like to say hi to all people who have been logged on from Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela, especially the health staff from the ministries of health and the participants of the other countries of the region. I would like to hand the mic to Ruby Diaz, professional of global health, member of the committee of NotiSalud Andina newsletter, which this month will publish its 71st edition. Go ahead, Ruby. Thank you very much, Forley, for the introduction. I would like to take and inform you that you can have access to all of the editions of the NotiSalud Andina newsletter through our website, www.horasconu.org/yes. So, well, to continue with this important event, we would like to give a warm welcome to Arivera. Arivera Morales is a trans woman originally from the port of Veracruz. In her professional career, she began studying a degree in special education with a specialty in learning disabilities at the Escuela Normal Veracruzana Enrique C. Repsamen, facing her first obstacle, since she was not allowed to continue. Without giving up, she studied a degree in marketing at the Universidad Insurgentes in Mexico City. Later, she studied a master's course in defense and promotion of human rights at Universidad Autónoma de la Ciudad de México. She has several courses and diplomas, among which we have the diploma in political marketing from the Faculty of Political Science and the diploma on the right to non-discrimination from the Institute of Legal Research of the UNAM. Her interest in working with vulnerable populations stems from some personal and close experiences, arising thus the association Almas Cautivas, which works on behalf of the LGBTI community, deprived of liberty in prisons in Mexico City, and of which she serves as president. She's also founder of the international network Compora en Libertad, a group of LGBT organizations in the world dedicated to the protection and defense of LGBT people in prison. She's a co-secretary of the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association for Latin America and the Caribbean, and member also of the Consulting Assembly of the Council to Prevent and Eliminate Discrimination in Mexico City. She's also the president of the Mexican Federation of LGBT Entrepreneurs, which specializes in creating discrimination-free workplaces. She considers that one idea that defines her is, even in the darkest places like prisons, dignity, respect, and love must always be guaranteed. Welcome, Ms. Vera. The space is yours. Thank you very much, Ruby, for this introduction. And thank you very much to Dr. Calle for having invited us to this space. It is a pleasure for me to share this space with Dr. Elida and Commissioner Roberta Clark. So, all my greetings to you. So, in this meeting, in these minutes that I have for my presentation, I wanted to start by mentioning that the Latin American region, well, thanks to the power of our LGBTI movement and human rights activists, have made a lot of progress around the world. However, all of the countries are in constant movement and have made progress thanks to this fight. Among this progress, we need to mention the creation of the Yogyakarta principles, one of the principles that most of the states have used as an instrument of soft love, as a way to create policies in favor of LGBTI people. Throughout my intervention, I will be mentioning the pros and cons of these issues. In 2022, unfortunately, the Yogyakarta principles were mentioned by someone at the Inter-American Court and should not be used as self-love. And this is where we start seeing how the progress starts to become darker in view of the stigma and prejudice that some people have. And people from institutes should guarantee human rights. Also, some of the other progress is a core group in 2008 by the UN. And as the Commissioner Roberta Clark mentioned, the Inter-American Commission Against All Types of Discrimination, Intolerance, starting in 2013, which was signed by Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Haiti, Panama, Peru, but it's been signed and ratified by Mexico and Uruguay. Therefore, as my predecessors have said already, have mentioned, the case of Argentina, it is important to highlight this. It has a same-sex law, an adoption law, a gender identity law, a Ministry of Women, Gender and Diversity, an Undersecretary of Diversity Policy at the federal level has approved the law for voluntary interruption of a pregnancy, and it has a labor law for 1% of jobs. It has benefited more than 300 trans people who have entered the federal order, but there are still challenges. And as the Commissioner Clark mentioned, they have recognized as part of the IDs, non-binary people have been recognized. So the last edition of the report by the end of 2020 should be supplemented with a Elida report on our identities under arrest of 2021. Our region has a particularity which has to do with the fact that the sexual orientation and gender identity has been criminalized, and this has been changing in our region. The security forces and the judicial officers use other figures to prosecute and criminalize our community with names which are reflecting discrimination, and laws or policies where LGBTI people are victims of the judicial systems. The production of these reports is in debt by the states because most of the production of these reports and research on the situation of LGBTI people fall on the civil society associations and autonomous organizations for the defense of or advocacy of human rights, as the one I have just mentioned on Hidromundo, where the report on homophobia and Estado state that there are 69 countries which are criminalizing same-sex relations, and 5 of them have included death penalty against this group. We have mapped the development of differentiated impact on trans women in our region. It is important to mention that there are other reports from the civil society which make other agendas visible, agendas which have not been visibilized before. The Caribe Affirmative Organization speaks about LGBTI people with armed conflicts, or the recent research by the Corpo Libertad Association, which deals with generating an X-ray on LGBTI people who come to the prisons and how their lives have been before and after they have been imprisoned, and this is important. Another progress made by the region, the renewal of the independent expert by the United Nations, which is fundamental to keep moving in terms of our rights. This renewal has been thanks to the LGBTI movement, which has worked overall, and we've been leading this process. And for the first time ever, the 8 countries of Latin America, which are part of the Human Rights Council, voted in favor of the ratification of the independent expert figure: Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, Honduras, Bolivia, Cuba, Venezuela, and Paraguay. Though internally, this predisposition or this empathy has not been reflected in national policies. Our region is always in tension. On the one hand, we have some hope and big progress. The perspectives in Colombia or Honduras, but on the other hand, we have the ultra-right progress, persistence in religious fundamentalists and in some left-wing groups which face them all the time. We are now at a crossroads, and we want to double these efforts to defend what we have already accomplished and go out for more. Of course, within the LGBTI community and diversity, we are the group which sometimes does not have access to resources and rights. So it is important to use our to work to gain equality and justice for this. In Colombia, for instance, there have been important progress made thanks to this impressive social movement. which we all admire so much and we respect so much. And this is why it has positioned itself as an important country in the region. We know about the efforts by the organizations and advocates, and there's been legal equality that we have achieved there. And we hope we can combine this with social equality. We, of course, are always striving to reach this peace, and we embrace this fight. This is why the states need to design and implement policies that will be decentralized, that will consider the problems of each one of these LGBTI identities. From the base grassroots organizations and regional organizations, we urge the states to design and implement and develop plans, programs, and projects where they will put LGBTI people in the core of it. So it is important, and this is the case of many countries, we celebrate this uh, process, monitoring process that the organizations have implemented. Implementation of these public policies for visibilization and social inclusion of LGBTI people is fundamental, especially with this intersectoral approach that I have mentioned before, anti-racist, territorial. We cannot not include within these policies those LGBTI people which have been deprived from their freedom, LGBTI people living in rural areas, LGBTI people we have functional disabilities, migrating populations. These policies, which won't take this into account, will be like an empty shell, a political strategy that is only good for the states and governments, which will negotiate with our bodies in exchange for resources. And this is something that we need to prevent. LGBTI people, of course, we have to occupy all the spaces. We have to be present in all the links and levels. And this is something that favors social change. As Luana Berkey said in Argentina, when she was speaking about the access to education, and I quote, when a transvestite goes to college, her life changes, but when a transvestite or when many transvestites go to college, the whole society changes. I think that our movement has different agendas. Our region is diverse, it is unequal, and in some countries, there's even a discussion of political participation, and unfortunately, in others, the right to live and the right not be killed, or both at the same time. It is important, as part of our region, to encourage political parties to deconstruct and include in their lives and in their decision making not only the LGBTI agenda, but also LGBTI people. How many LGBTI people are there in public positions? Are we present in all the institutions? Are we what are we supposed to obtain? It's not only about the most privileged as men, but we should we have to include everyone in the political arena. This needs to come along with a social justice program to include those people who have the least access to rights. The region, of course, has important challenges ahead. Even in some countries, like I mentioned a while ago, the problem in the lack of juridical harmonization. There are lots of international human rights treaties which have been signed, but in their internal laws, there's still a lot of room for improvement. to materialize substantial equality. Throughout the region, LGBTI people are still being killed. They are crimes that are not investigated. Many LGBTI people cannot have access to rights. Trans women do not have a formal employment. The prisons are inhabited by poor LGBTI. Abortion needs to be legal in most of our territories. If something we know is that we always have to pay attention, and this is why we are keeping ourselves organized and we're still fighting to revert these inequalities. So, still, in some countries of our region, there are measures which aim at creating locks to some local organizations, like in the recent law in Guatemala, which is trying to control or register the activities of the civil society, where there's no control of international funds. And same thing happens in Nicaragua. The civil society organizations, the LGBTI organizations have lots of limitations in terms of development processes. They're oftentimes find limits to international cooperations from those countries that are receiving these benefits. And this is because of those governments which are actually corrupt. Most of the civil society organizations are of the LGBTI are small or medium in size, and therefore they have some structural weaknesses and organizational weaknesses, and this makes them have more difficulties in accessing resources or reaching spaces. And sometimes there's extra effort and a lack of financial capacity. And the impostor syndrome, where sometimes values should be free. There's a lot of resistance in the private environment, the lack of data that I mentioned throughout and the appearance of the anti-right movements. And especially gender approach has reduced in this region. Today, we have a reductionist approach where the realities of LGBTI people are not visible. My predecessors have mentioned the differential impact in extraordinary situations that are faced by LGBTI, like COVID-19. But let's not forget what LGBTI people have to live in prisons, the LGBTI people who migrate, the LGBTI people who are living under corrupt governments. So, what are the proposals that we need to embrace to strengthen an LGBTI movement in our region? Of course, I think that one of the ways to go about is to strengthen the LGBTI structure. We have to push and we have to work on gender with different perspectives and gender identity. We have to look for mechanisms, international cooperation mechanisms with umbrella financing that might strengthen organizations of the civil society. And last, of course, we have to work under the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 agenda with gender approach, and the work in networks to strengthen the work of LGBTI organizations. It's like creating better societies with a better state of well-being for all people who are diverse. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, estimada Magíster Vera.
Thank you very much, Ms. Vera. We would like to thank you again for your lecture. Ari Vera has shared with us important breakthroughs in guaranteeing rights of the LGBTIQ plus community with, well, first she started mentioning the Yogyakarta principles, the core group and the United Nations, the different reports that the civil society has implemented and which tackle the LGBTIQ plus situation in different contexts. One of the most important ones being the deprivation of their liberties and armed conflict. She also mentioned that despite this progress, there's a lot to work on. And this is something that is reflected in these 69 countries which are penalizing same-sex marriages. And even in those countries where there's progress made, there's still they are still criminalizing people in the community. She advises to incorporate plans that will put the LGBTIQ plus community in the center and harmonizing the legal aspects among the different countries and also within by incorporating a multi-sectionality approach with territorial approach and an anti-racist approach that will tackle the different inequalities that these marginalized populations have to live with. Something that she allowed us to see is that Latin America, being such a diverse region, it is fair to recognize gender diversity, and we cannot put it off anymore. Thank you very much, Arivera. We want to thank you again for your lecture. Now we will break for a while so then, after these moments of learning and knowledge exchange, it is essential to take some time to relax and start a mini physical exercise session while teleworking. The Horas Coni encourages the well-being of those who join us in this virtual session, and these next few minutes will be we will exercise with an active pause to stay healthy, combat stress, reduce work fatigue, and keep muscles flexible and healthy. Please go ahead with the active pause.
Buenos días, buenas tardes, desde donde quieras que te encuentres en cualquier parte del mundo, desde el Organismo Andino de Salud Convenio Hipólito Unanue estamos muy felices de recibirlos en esta actividad saludable. Hoy bienvenidos a liberar las tensiones acumuladas en la espalda y en los hombros y solamente utilizaremos nuestras sillas. Así que vamos a arrancar calentando de una vez. Quiero que te imagines en una piscina y que estás nadando hacia el frente, nadie hacia el frente, perfecto, el que no nade se hunde, perfecto, ánimo, energía, eso es, vamos, calentando los brazos, los hombros para liberar las tensiones de la espalda, bueno, sabe que nadie hacia atrás, vamos, energía positiva, brazos amplios, grandes, generosos, excelente. Bueno, y el que se descoordine gasta algo. Con el brazo derecho nado al frente, con el izquierdo nado hacia atrás. Caliénteme los brazos. Perfecto. ¿Cómo están? En una piscina en Bolivia, en Chile, en Colombia, en Ecuador, en Perú, en Venezuela. Excelente. Liberando estrés. Cambie, cambie. Entonces, brazo contrario adelante, izquierdo adelante, derecho hacia atrás. Si se puede, domínelo, caliente la espalda, los brazos, los hombros. Muy bien, y descanso. Muy bien. Segundo ejercicio rápido de calentamiento. Quiero que nos aprendamos dos posiciones. Primera posición, manos a la cintura, llevas atrás, los codos, pecho adelante, muy bien, mira hacia arriba, muy bien, pelvis hacia atrás, perfecto, estira un poquito hacia el frente, posición 2, justamente la contraria, bajas la mirada, brazos adelante, pecho hacia adentro, espalda flexionada y vamos a llevar la cadera, la pelvis hacia adelante, miro hacia abajo. Esa va a ser la posición número 2. Cambio, mira arriba, perfecto. Cambio abajo, cambio arriba, perfecto. Cambio abajo y cambie periódicamente. Mover la columna vertebral es algo 100% saludable para aliviar tensiones en la espalda. Perfecto, 3 más de esos, 2 más de esos. Último. Y descanse. Muy bien, excelente. Ya hay calorcito. Así que vamos a hacer 2, 3 posturas para soltar tensiones de la espalda. La primera, quiero que te ubiques al lado de tu silla, al ladito de tu silla. Separa las piernas. Muy bien. Vas a apoyar la mano más cerca de la silla, en ella. La otra mano, bien arriba, arriba. Pégala a las orejas, muy bien. Cuando las tengas allí, mira. Esa mano va a ir a buscar el otro extremo de la silla, va, búsquelo, agarre ese extremo de la silla, sonría, respire y vas a sentir la tensión, la liberación en la espalda, parte lateral, zona lumbar, eso es, respire, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, regreso y me estiro, wow, como que se siente, perfecto. Pero vamos a hacer el contrario, entonces me voy a ubicar al otro lado de mi silla. Recuerda que el brazo más cercano lo apoyo en la silla, separo las piernas, muy bien. Brazo contrario arriba, péguelo a la oreja y voy al lado, y trate de apoyar esa otra mano en la silla, si se puede. Maneja la respiración profunda, continua, desde casa, desde la oficina, desde donde te encuentres puedes hacer estos ejercicios que traemos desde el Organismo Andino de Salud, Convenio Hipólito Unanue. Vamos, regreso, me estiro, perfecto, excelente. ¿Cómo vamos hasta aquí? ¿Bien o no? Excelente. Vamos a darle la espalda a nuestra silla y vamos a poner nuestras manos, vamos a apoyar las manos en la silla, vamos a llevar el pecho adelante, mirada hacia arriba, estiro y empiezo a liberar ese cansancio físico, mental, emocional, todo lo que nos afecta en nuestra vida a través de la actividad física, los estiramientos, el salir de la rutina. Tomo aire, exhalo y descanso. Hombros adelante, crocanticos, crujientes. Muy bien, excelente. Siguiente postura, súper recomendado para las tensiones de la espalda. Así que acompáñame. Vamos a apoyar las dos manos en nuestro asiento. Muy bien, separo las piernas. Quiero que estires las piernas y mira, llevas la silla hacia adelante o tu cadera hacia atrás. Y vamos a empezar a bajar. Baje, cadera hacia atrás, apoyo. Muy bien, y voy a tratar de alinear mi espalda con el espaldar de la silla. Voy a sentir ese estiramiento, mire, desde las piernas, zona lumbar, espalda, brazos, estírese. Y ahí nos vamos a quedar 20 segunditos. Así que respire, eso es energía positiva. 10, 9, 8, 7, si se puede, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, tomo aire, 1 y muy despacio me regreso y ay, como que se va sintiendo la distensión en la espalda. Eso es, desde horas como voy trayendo estos ejercicios para sentirnos bien. Bueno, vamos a repetir ese ejercicio y le vamos a hacer una variante, ¿listo? Bueno, apoya las manos en tu silla, llevas al frente, te apoyas, te estiras. Perfecto, cuando estés allí, quiero que subas un brazo, mire, y vas a mirar ese brazo arriba, se estira. Mi otra mano está bien apoyada en el asiento, manejo la respiración, Profunda, continua, regreso y vamos a ir al lado contrario. Entonces subes brazo contrario arriba, te estiras. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Apoya las dos manos, perfecto. Regresas en cámara lenta, regresas en cámara lenta, regreso, 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 regreso. Ay, descansa. Se vale despeinarse, se vale despeinarse, se vale todo. La pausa activa del día de hoy. Desde Loras Como estamos muy felices de traerles estas pausas activas diferentes, divertidas, dinámicas y que favorezcan nuestro estado de salud. Así que los animamos a seguirlas realizando. Un abrazo fraternal, los queremos mucho. Chao, chao.
Excelente. Esperamos que hayan
Excellent. We hope you have enjoyed this active pause. Now we will open the floor for questions and answers. And to get started with this important dialogue stemming from the questions asked by the audience who's joining us, we want to invite our speakers to keep their cameras on. Throughout this webinar, we've been receiving some questions, and we will put all of the efforts to include all of the questions. The first two questions are addressed to Commissioner Roberta Clark, which or who, because of some compromises she has, will have to leave shortly. And these two questions go as follow. What recommendations does the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights give for human resources related to intersex children? The second question is, what could you say are the legal milestones achieved in the region towards the respect of the rights of the LGBTIQ plus community?
Yeah. Thank you. I'm not quite sure I understand the first question. What recommendations are made for human resources for intersex children? I don't quite understand that question. So, but I can answer the second one. The second question is about the legal developments towards the respect of LGBTI persons. Yeah, so I think I think all three of us try to outline some of those legal developments, Elida, Rivera, and myself. But just maybe restate a few of them. At the most fundamental level, the recognition that all states have an obligation to eliminate all forms of discrimination against LGBTI persons, and that the non-discrimination guarantees in the American Convention on Human Rights, although it does not include the words sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, those characteristics are also prohibited grounds of discrimination. And that has become part of what we call customary international human rights law. And many countries in the region have that encoded in their constitutions and prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. There are many countries that have also, or a growing number of countries that are also seeking to protect LGBTI persons from discriminatory acts on the part of non-state actors. So we're seeing equality of opportunity in employment in some countries. Very recently, I think last year in Barbados, protection against discrimination in employment was passed, including on the basis of sexual orientation and sex. So we're seeing also the non-discrimination protection being extended, or non-discrimination obligation being extended to non-state actors in a variety of contexts. The right to gender identity, I think I spoke about that, has been recognized in some countries. The right to same-sex marriage, similarly, and also the right to gender identity has been recognized and is being enforced in some countries, including with attention to easy administrative procedures to actually change one's ID cards, passports, and national IDs to match one's gender identity. In the Caribbean, the progress that we're making now, and I am in the Caribbean right now, is on the decriminalization of same-sex intimacy between consenting adults. And so that's also quite huge progress. So we're seeing, and also the availability of identity markers for persons who are gender non-conforming or who choose not to identify either as male or female. That's also, I think, an important development. So I think that these developments are also signaling a bit of change in culture, but it's not enough, and those developments are not fast enough either. We have a lot of more work to do on ensuring non-discrimination in laws and policies, and importantly, in the behavior of state actors and in culture. I'll stop there. Oh, and on the question of the human resources, I don't know, perhaps that question can, perhaps Elida, I don't know, maybe, I'm not quite sure what the question is getting at. I'm sorry.
Le cedemos la palabra, estimada doctora Guerra.
Sí, Obi, yo quisiera pedirte, por favor, si
Yes,
podrías
I have not understood the question either, and I've been listening in Spanish directly. So could you please rephrase this question? What are the recommendations that you could provide to human resources serving intersex children from the diversity perspective? So I agree with Roberta. I don't understand the question, but there's no thorough approach towards intersex people. This is always something that accounts for a big challenge, because we are speaking about trans people and the rights they have, but regarding intersex people, this is actually a big, there's a gap here. We have even prepared some documents from the United Nations regarding access to economic, social, and cultural rights, particularly the rights to health of intersex people. And let me share a case that we have in Peru. It's Ada. It's an intersex person who wanted to have access to a health center in Peru to be taken care of, but there was an ID that was actually not reflecting, not representing this person. So in view of this, we presented this to the court in Peru, and we are awaiting resolution. To us, this represented a challenge, because we don't know what are the international standards that protect these intersex people, and hence, what are the where's the protection of the rights of these people? But I'm sorry, but the person has asked about this question. I'm sorry if we have not responded, but maybe they could rephrase their question to start with.
Can I add to something Elida said there, if I just may? I think, okay, and the person may reframe the question, but I think what we would all agree is that everyone is equal in dignity and autonomy. And so when we're thinking about intersex children, also to come with that frame, and I think this whole question of conversion therapy is also relevant to intersex children, so that children are not subject to procedures, either cultural, social, educational procedures that are repressive or undermining their identities, however they understand themselves, and also not subject to medical procedures. So I think that that's also something that that the Commission is very concerned about that children are not subjected to medical procedures or to conversion therapies of any sort, and that children are allowed to be who they are until they get to the stage where they may, if they want to, but they may not want to make an election about how they appear in the world and how they present to others. So I think it is not a non-interference obligation. You know, we say protect, respect, and fulfill. Sometimes the state has an obligation to intervene and to protect, and sometimes it has an obligation to just respect and to refrain from acting or refrain from interfering. So I would say that that's also some of the issues which are raised when we think about intersex persons. The right to self-determination and to self-identity, very, very important, and the right not to be interfered with and to be treated equally, particularly as children in the context of access to healthcare, access to education, access to child protection, all of those things that maintain the dignity and equality of all children.
Excelente, muchas gracias por las respuestas.
Thank you very much for your answers. And for your explanations. I'm sure that your answers will help in clarifying the understanding of this topic. Now, because of time reasons, I would like to request Commissioner Clark to give a message as a takeaway message to the audience before she leaves. It's like a conclusion that we would like you to share.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think first of all, I want to say that we need to celebrate and honor LGBTI human rights defenders. That a lot of the progress that we claim, and we are proud about this progress which has been achieved because of the insistence and the courage of LGBTI persons standing up for themselves and standing up for other people. So that's the first thing. You know, we must always honor the activists amongst us who are on the front lines of advancing rights. But then to say that LGBTI persons need allies, but not passive allies. They need active allies, persons who will accept the responsibility, because having equal societies is a responsibility that we all share in exactly the same way. And so everyone has to be engaged in this demand for equality and justice and freedom for everyone to be and to live and to love. And so I just want to end that way. The Inter-American Commission is very alert and monitoring the status of LGBTI persons, and also seeking to advance the standards, the Inter-American human rights standards, so that not only do these standards are not only standards words, but they're standards that are felt and experienced in the lives of LGBTI persons. So to have better quality of life for all. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to participate. I really enjoy listening to Elida and Elida Guerra and Forley, your nice summaries. Thank you very much for that, and to everyone, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Roberta Clark. You are invited to stay in the room if you can. We understand, however, that because of your multiple activities and commitments, keeping in the room might be complicated. And hence, we would like to thank you for your important participation in this event. So now we will share questions for Dr. Elida Guerra. We have two questions. The first question is about the political lobbying for the development of policies in view of the structural inequalities affecting the community. What are the priority actions that will need to be implemented when there's a lot of conservationism. And then based on the experience in creating the observatory of violence against women, what lessons need to be rescued for developing statistics for these groups?
Bueno, si me permiten,
So if you allow me,
comenzar con la segunda pregunta sobre la base de datos desagregados para luego abordar lo de la incidencia. En principio,
so
algo que sí ha quedado embarcado con la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos en el caso de
something that
Perú
we
es,
have mentioned
hablando de Perú en particular, debería tener un registro
now,
único
speaking
desagregado
about
de
Peru,
la violencia y discriminación hacia las personas LGBTI. Sin embargo, hemos anotado que en muchos países de la región todavía es un problema persistente el no contar con registros únicos. En el caso peruano, si bien nosotros tenemos un registro parcializado de algunas entidades, como por ejemplo el Ministerio de la Mujer a través de los centros de emergencia mujer, que recoge la violencia hacia las personas LGBTI, pero no los desagrega. También tenemos por su lado el CONACOT y también tenemos el Ministerio Público que recientemente publicaron un informe interesante sobre también la violencia hacia las personas LGBTI. Sin embargo, nosotros sí creemos que podría ser muy saludable que las instituciones, todas las instituciones podrían coordinar acciones para viabilizar un buen registro. No solamente primero establecer un censo o por lo menos una encuesta nacional en la que podamos identificar cuál es la situación de violencia y discriminación de las personas LGBTI y sobre ese punto de partida conocer las necesidades que tiene
to know about the needs that this community has, to then start working on it, because not having a single registry means that we cannot tackle the particular needs if we do not know the real condition of these victims. So this is an important task that we have to implement. So not having this national survey. It should not only be virtual, because virtual, we know that not all the people will have access to this. And the second thing is that all the institutions need to generate a registry. And this registry might also work around the different categories. The worst thing that we can do is to work on gender identity, but we might forget about sexual orientation. So we need to cover all of these categories, and we have to work on raising awareness and training beforehand. And then we will know what are the categories that we need to break down. This is regarding your second point. Now, regarding the issue of lobbying, there are adverse situations when there are movements that go against the right, or conservationists which are against the LGBTI defense. And in Latin America, unfortunately, this happens in Peru, and we have exported this to other countries of the region, but we have to recognize that in other countries, there's still an anti-right agenda, which plays a very important role. We have, well, in the civil society, might identify actors in lobbying. The allies are important. Identifying who are the allies. It's not only the academia, but the civil society, international organizations, which promote the respect of human rights. Our colleague Arivera mentioned the mandate of the independent expert, and this is a healthy attitude, because we know that there was a very active participation, and not mentioned Roberta Clark, who has been part of these spaces. We have to identify our allies. This is key. And the second thing will be to be acquainted with the legislative initiatives that we be part of the baseline, and who will the agencies and entities that will support this. A very healthy attitude is to be able to coordinate with the other state-owned institutions so that they will give their technical opinion. This technical opinion is like a way to guarantee in the promotion of the LGBTI rights. And finally, the generation of evidence, not only in terms of findings or exploratory studies. We will then know what to do. I think that if we carry out specific activities, we might be able to combat any of these situations or counteract some of these problems. Thank you very much for your answers, Dr. Guerra. Now we have questions for Arivera. The first question, what are the main resources that have been used to move on and advance in the rights against in the rights of LGBTI people? And what are the mechanisms in the framework conventions to make progress at the local level? And there's a third question also, how to attain the most of participation in political spaces. Thank you very much. The mechanisms to guarantee human rights, in this case, specifically dealing with LGBTI, we will, well, it might sound weird, but it depends on the political will. If it's true that the states are mandated to guarantee human rights in all people, the problem resides in how to harmonize all the different levels with the international law. And this is something that has entailed a great deal of work, where key actors have actually hindered this harmonization because of the lack of political will, the lack of empathy, prejudice, and stigma. I will give you an example. It's true that Mexico has signed and ratified the Inter-American Convention Against All Ways of Discrimination. The City of Mexico, in its political constitution, speaks about the right of non-discrimination and the recognition of gender identity. For instance, this is not being reflected in the prisons, where there's trans women who are deprived of their freedom and they are not being recognized their self-perceived identity. In many of these cases, even when they have a legal gender identity which has been recognized in legal terms, they are placed in male prisons because of the lack of empathy, awareness, and the lack of legal harmonization with international and national laws and state laws. So oftentimes, the mechanisms have to follow different means the civil organizations need to introduce the reforms that are necessary to crosscut the guarantee of the LGBTI rights in the states. This is a fight that we have to continue day in, day out. How to reach certain levels of participation. And I'm speaking on behalf of Mexico. We have political parties in Mexico where they are discussing the importance of the community's participation on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have a elections tribunal where they have established that there's a need to include LGBTI representatives in 1%. Even so, we have two trans representatives, the Chamber of Representatives in Mexico, and we have mayors and Congress representatives who are also LGBTI people. However, there's still a lot to be done. Something that I always mention is that while it is true that you can be, you can not agree with the way that some people choose to live, that's okay. You need not be anti-right. So this is the starting point. And I think that this should be the main resources to move forward in the human rights of LGBTI people, irrespective of our political orientation or religious beliefs, and irrespective of our how conservative we might be. We cannot be anti-right people. Thank you very much, Arivera. We have another question
Ponentes es la
for all
siguiente.
the speakers, and it has to do with the last answer given. What are the these terms which are sometimes used, like quote unquote homosexualization agenda or damage to principles or morals. In view of these opinions, what are the strategies that are being proposed to tackle this sort of not those things that are being said, but also the actions that are taken by people who are not respecting LGBTI rights in these cases? Why don't we change the order? Maybe Ari could start replying to this question. Well, actually, I think that this is a pretty long answer that I would have to give, and it will take a whole different conference to speak about this approach. However, we have to start with the idea that the progress made in terms of recognizing LGBTI rights not only have an impact in this group, but all of the other people who coexist in a given society. At Mexico City, it was one of the cities where the gender identity was legally recognized, not only benefited trans people, but also when considering this reality, it gave the possibility to elderly people who would not have access to their pensions because there were differences in the way they were registered to start with by way of this modification in the law. These people were assisted in correcting this information and then having access to their pension. So this not only benefits LGBTI people, but all of the people who is part of the society, first of all. And then I think that all the collectives need to bear this responsibility of informing about the progress, about the challenges, the problems, and the difficulties faced by the LGBTI group, because there's a lot of misinformation out there, which is misleading. When at some spaces mention has been given to women and pregnant women, sometimes there are people who said, I don't agree with gender identity and the trans law because I cannot tell my mom. Well, there's been a lot of confusion and misinformation from anti-right and conservative groups that try to create a narrative against the recognition of rights. And this is another mechanism that civil organizations need to work on. We need to communicate better with the society. We don't want to turn the society, the whole society, into LGBTI people. We want them to have a violence-free life, irrespective of their gender identity. We want children not to suffer this harassment and this violence. Claire and Dr. Elida mentioned the conversion therapy spaces where they are looking to convert quote unquote people, removing them from their homosexuality through torture, electroshock among these methods, or religious sessions. However, if we see this even in a finer way, sometimes the behavior codes at a school might look like conversion therapy. The fact that you are asked to cut your hair or behave in such and such way, this is a very subtle way to convert someone, a non-binary person, into someone that will fit in this society. There are many answers to this question, but we have to focus our work in the dignity of people. When we think and focus on this, we will then be generating better societies. Thank you very much for your response, Arivera. Then we will move on with Eli. Well, I run short in my reply because I totally agree with Ari's reply. But I would like to mention that what we pretend is to have a violence-free environment, and we are discussing human rights, and human rights are cross-cutting, meaning that everyone has a right to dignity, to a safe environment, to be free, to have their rights respected. But there needs to be special protection. And indeed, the only thing that we are requesting here is tolerance and respect to human rights, because we are speaking about human rights, and human rights that have also been acknowledged by international agencies, national institutions also, and the framework of conventions which have to be applied domestically, national-wise. So all of the people, officers, and so on need to respect and guarantee the right of LGBTI people. This is essential to work on the consolidation of democratic states, and this is the only way to go about. Well, thank you very much for your excellent answers. We would like to thank all of the people who have attended and to close this space. We would like to request the speakers to leave a message in 1 minute.
También vamos a continuar con el orden, comenzando con la magistra Rivera.
Let's start with Ari, please. Well, thank you. Well, I would like to conclude by giving this message out. We have to acknowledge human diversity. Human diversity makes us stronger, knowing there's a lot of worlds as part of one world. Let's not forget that we are dignified people. We all have some dignity, and irrespective of the differences, where we have coincidences as well, is human dignity. And diversity makes us stronger. Thank you very much for the invitation to this webinar. And I would like to say hi to all of the people who have joined this call. Thank you very much for your time. There are still challenges, I would like to say. Challenges in terms of the rights of LGBTI groups. The commissioner mentioned this, and it's healthy to think that if we look for the respect of guaranteeing the rights of LGBTI, we are looking for our own rights as well. And this is something that I wanted to mention. Thank you very much. Again, thank you very much for the invitation and for being part of this event together with the other speakers. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for your leadership in your spaces. And thank you very much for these messages that you've been sending out. And this is not something for the audience who's been logging onto this call, but this is something that will remain in the YouTube videos and Facebook videos as well. Once again, I would like to thank our excellent speakers and all of the attendees who are joining us every week, the Orasconu team, and all of the people who have been part of this activity, which has been possible thanks to the commitment between the Andean integration and Latin America. I would like to give the floor to Marisela Malki, the Secretary of Orasconu, to close this webinar on behalf of the Orasconu. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, our excellent speakers, for having devoted so much time. I think that we have even surpassed the allotted time. Thank you for having shared with us all of your ideas. The Orasconu has been the promoter of these shared spaces around, well, first COVID and all of the issues linked to the health space. Now we have dealt with gender and sexual identity, some updates in terms of the right that need to be guaranteed to these populations. There are different reports from the United Nations and from the civil society and show what's the situation of the LGBTI group regarding the existing gaps in terms of the right to health, education, justice, Well, no doubt there's an international legal framework, a national framework in the countries which are not, unfortunately, fully implemented and are not still enough. It is true that there's been progress. There's progress. We cannot deny this, but still, this is not sufficient and it's quite heterogeneous. And there have been important steps taken forward. And this is the only way that will lead to having all of those rights being respected. We have organized this meeting, and this revolves around the issue of having all people's rights respected in a cross-cutting manner. There are special care that needs to be guaranteed to some groups which are special. There's a lot to be done in this field, and the horas, together with the organizations and groups of people who deal with these topics, we will keep on listening to what they bring in terms of the news. And I would like to thank once again our speakers, Ruby, Forley, who have been the organizers of this webinar, our audience, who's always there and share with us their concerns, and also help us in defining topics for discussion in our webinars. And we are coming back on January 19th. We will start our first webinar of 2023. So we wish you happy holidays with your families, with your loved ones, and let's hope that peace will reign in all of our countries. There are lots of expectations for next year. Well, thank you very much to each one of you. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.